myth, legend, rotten old historiography about the Trans-Mississippi I can think of, because I've been asked to try and convince you that the Trans-Mississippi is a waste of time and resource for both sides. So if I don't upset at least one of our speakers for tomorrow, I will not have achieved my objective. So I'm sure Mike is going to talk about all the fascinating battles that go on in Missouri, in Arkansas, in Louisiana. And they're fascinating, there are great mistakes made, there are very heroic actions, troops behave well, troops behave badly, but at the risk of upsetting at least half the people in the room, I'm going to say, and to steal a line from a more recent war, it's two bald men fighting over a comb. It's a sideshow, and I'm going to speak about why I think it's a sideshow. But first of all, looking at the map, I can see why it looks significant beyond the Trans-Mississippi. If you look at the south, first of all, you're talking about almost 49% of the territory of the Confederate States is beyond the Mississippi. But it's less than 20% of the population. And most of that population are not rebellious Confederates, nor are they loyal Federals. Most of the people in that area, over the age of 18, are former Mexicans, who probably don't care either way what the outcome is. And also, not just thinking about the Mexicans, that map, or the map that would have existed at the time, is probably very misleading, because it suggests there are states and territories under the control of the North or the South. I suspect you could draw a different map with territories called Apacheria, Comancheria, the Sioux Nation, the Kiowa, the Pawnee, the Shawnee, who really have no vested interest in the war that's going on, other than to make his life difficult for the Long Knives, whatever colour uniform they make, wear as possible. And the war in the West goes on. It may not be US regulars, it may be local militia, but the war in the West against the Native American goes on almost unabated, unchanged. So, in the north, the northern side, the states are more populous. There are farmers and cities to recruit from. But if you take every state and territory west of the Mississippi that sent men to the Union, including the southern states, they are still outnumbered by tens of thousands just by the recruits from the state of New York, drowned in numbers. So, as I said, I'm not going to talk about battles, but I thought I'd talk about something much funnier and much more interesting: logistics and infrastructure, just to get things going. So in the south, there are supposedly 113 railways at the start of the war. 13 of them are supposed to be west of the Mississippi. That's the big logistics and infrastructure base for moving things around in the south. Well, let's just talk a minute about some of those railroads that people will be fighting over and expecting to use. There's the Memphis and Little Rock, which goes from Memphis to, well, not Little Rock, that's for sure. It stops just outside of Memphis. Vicksburg, Shreveport in Texas goes from Vicksburg, well, it doesn't go to Shreveport, and it doesn't even leave the state of Louisiana. Memphis, El Paso, and Pacific, a very grandly named railroad, very ambitious. It doesn't exist. It's a few embankments and some rails. And the logistics in the Trans-Mississippi are so important that those rails are taken by the government to be used for an ironclad which gets scuttled without being used. The South Pacific Railroad, another grandly sounding name, well, that gets removed in its entirety and shifted to build another few feet on the end of the Shreveport Railroad that still doesn't go anywhere near Texas. The Baton Rouge, Grosse Tete, and Opelousas. That falls apart by 1862. The Houston Tap and Brazoria, one train. It wears out in 18 months. Oxen drag the carriages along that rail. That's 3 to 5 times the length of time it took the one train. King Cotton's transport system beyond the Trans-Mississippi was not complete. And frankly, much, especially of the southern half of the Trans-Mississippi, would not only be isolated during the war, it would remain isolated for many years after the war. But you might say, Ryan, you're obsessed with these trains, but look at that lovely long coastline along Texas and Louisiana. We've got blockade runners and we've got coastal vessels. Well, there were a number of coastal vessels that used to carry cotton. But they didn't go very far. They used to carry cotton along the coast to New Orleans. Most of them aren't fit for the Gulf in bad weather or beyond the Gulf. And frankly, there aren't a great many ports out there. There's one deep water port, Galveston, and Galveston is blockaded by August-September 62. Now you might say to me, but Ryan, the great John Bankhead Magruder kicks the Yankees out of Galveston. Well, he does and he doesn't. The Union Navy is in the harbour at Galveston. They get driven out just outside into the Gulf. So they may not be in Galveston's front room, but they're still in the porch, and you're still not getting a lot through there. As for blockade runners, I'm glad we've got a map. If you're in Bermuda, you're not looking to run all the way down, round Florida, past the Mobile blockade, past New Orleans, all the way to one of the ports along the Louisiana or Texas coast. You don't want to do it from the Bahamas either, really. You don't really have much running from Havana either until the last 3 months of the war, when they literally have no other option. And the ones that do run the blockade, what are they carrying? They're carrying cotton out and luxuries in. They're not carrying guns, they're not carrying powder. Why? Government can't pay them. They want to carry luxury items so they can turn a profit. So, we haven't got railway, we haven't got shipping, and even if we did have shipping, we've got the blockade. But Ryan, Mexico's just across the border. Matamoros is there. I've watched Gettysburg. I know that's where Fremantle came through. And if Fremantle came through from Matamoros, other stuff must be coming through. Well, it's not a deep water port. And things are not all that stable in Mexico at this point in history. So, if you want to ship things in through Matamoros, you've got to get past Governor Vidari and taxes, which are through the roof. It's not even profitable to run Texas cotton through the port. If you can get past Governor Vidari and his taxes, you've got to run through the bandits, French lancers, Mexican regulars, irregulars on both sides of the border, the Native Americans who are not all that keen on you, and you've still got a 2.5 month mule or wagon train to get anywhere near the Mississippi River. So in practice, some dry goods, some shoes, a little powder, not really anything to speak of in terms of guns, cannons, anything at all comes through Matamoros. So if you're in the south, you're not getting very much from Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana. You're not in control of Missouri after the first 5 minutes, so you're not getting much out of it. If you're in the north, you're getting some men, but New York is giving you more than that all by itself. Okay, so you've also sent troops across the Mississippi because you might not be getting much out of it, but it's your territory, you want to fight to defend it. Well, those troops, as far as the West is concerned, might as well be on the moon. Because anybody who follows, for example, Van Dorn's attempts to join Albert Sidney Johnson and the Battle of Shiloh know just how hard it is to get from A, which happens to be in Arkansas, to B, which is just about anywhere he wants to get to on the other side of the Mississippi. He's just bordering on impossible. He's weeks late. Weeks late. And that's the case for most of the attempts to shuffle troops across the Mississippi. So, it's isolated. You can't really get a lot of resources, especially in the south, across the border. You can't really shuffle troops backwards and forwards. It's It's not ideal. And look at Vicksburg. We know, if you're in Pemberton shoes, that the north is coming and you've got to get supplies together. Well, if Earl J. Hess is right, there are about 4 times as many supplies coming by rail from the east that are coming across the Mississippi from the west. In fact, food from the west is rotting on the levees on the various tributaries of the Mississippi River. There are no bridges. There aren't enough steam boats to take them across. It's not set up for that kind of trans-Mississippi transport. Well, you say, if all this is true, why is the Union trying so hard to split the Confederacy in half? I'll say, they're not. When Vicksburg falls, there's no talk about splitting the Confederacy in half. The cable doesn't say, we've split the East and Western Confederacy. The cable says something along the lines of, the father of the rivers flows unvexed to the sea. The Union has opened the great avenue from the Midwest out to New Orleans and the old trade system. Because trade before the war didn't flow east from Illinois, from Iowa, from Wisconsin, along the rails to the eastern ports. It flowed south along the Mississippi and left the country via New Orleans. They're opening a door not only to trade, but also to supplies flowing up and down the Mississippi River to enhance the campaigns in the Western theatre, not in the Trans-Mississippi. Well, if all that's true, what then did the leaders on both sides think of the Trans-Mississippi? Well, I think you can get some idea from the quality of characters they send out west. And already some might bristle and say it wasn't a dumping ground for the worst that the East and West had to offer. No, I would agree. There's quite a lot of homegrown rubbish too, out beyond the Trans-Mississippi. I don't think the Union's quite as bad as the Confederacy, but let's look at some of the characters. The Red River Campaign, Nathaniel P. Banks, politician, failure in every military campaign he's tried. Well, we'll keep him on the straight and narrow, we'll give him a good chief of staff. And they give him William B. Franklin, a man whose record isn't much better than Banks. Basically, if you tried to throw that campaign, you couldn't have picked 2 better guys unless Ben Butler was available. In terms of the preparations for the campaign, I think the report afterwards used words like corruption, graft and peculation. I'm not even sure I know what peculation means, but it sounds pretty bad. ERS can be the perfect combination of the unstoppable force and the immovable object. He's the immovable force, never knowingly seen moving. We've got John C. Fremont. There are many generals in the American Civil War who got that know-nothing tendency of not liking Europeans. John C. Fremont is almost unique, not liking Americans and preferring Europeans. I think Hungarian might have been the most common language spoken at his headquarters. Oh, and we're back to corruption again. At best, his preparations for his campaign's buying supplies were incompetent. At worst, it was suggested they were incredibly corrupt. Nathaniel Lyon. Well, we won't really know what Nathaniel Lyon was like because he died very early on, but his initial writing suggests he makes Sherman look like a bit of a namby-pamby. Nathaniel Lyon's comments on how the South should be treated during and after the war bordered on certain activities that might now be considered war crimes. Fairly hardcore. John Schofield. I hope there are a lot of George Thomas fans in the room who will share my distaste for John Schofield. Not a fan. And then the wonderful James Blunt. James Blunt would die, I don't mean the musician either. James Blunt, who would die after the war from a softening of the brain, possibly from a social illness we won't discuss. But I think some of the clues that the softening of the brain may have started early may already be clear during the Civil War. Not least that when given the option to leave John Schofield's command, he volunteers to stay. But compared with the Southern generals, they are the cream of the crop. Theo Holmes, described as old, sluggish, passive. He's thrown out of what would become the Army of Northern Virginia, just as it becomes the Army of Northern Virginia, and gets sent with that recommendation to command the Trans-Mississippi for a while. John Bankhead Magruder. Did he drink because he was sad that he lost his job? Or did he lose his job because he was sad that he drank? Or did he drink because he lost his job because he was sad? I think you can basically shuffle those three in any order you like and get some sense of John Bankhead Magruder's character. And yes, he did do great things in Galveston if you think shifting the Union Navy from the harbour to a few hundred yards off the coast was a significant achievement. Sterling Price. Useless at discipline, he quarrelled with every single general he served with or under without exception. His men liked him, but as I said, he was a terrible disciplinarian. His colleagues detested him, probably because he was a terrible disciplinarian. Earl Van Dorn. He had the rare joy of outnumbering a Union army on the field, and still lost because he couldn't cooperate with his fellow generals. Some of the descriptions of him are wonderful. Petulant, negligent, whoring drunk. But my personal favourite is, when Earl Van Dorn was made a general, it spoiled a perfectly good captain. Some of the other fun generals who inspire hilarious comments. Hamilton P.B. The poorest excuse for a general I ever saw. One of his colleagues said, it would be a public calamity if I ever knew of his being assigned another important command. Benjamin Huger, another ageing and inefficient general who didn't quite meet Lee's standards. Well, he gets promoted west to an inspector general, or to put it another way, look at the soldiers but don't touch. Now, some people might say, you're deliberately avoiding Richard Taylor, the one bright star in the Trans-Mississippi. Well, he is, unless you're his commanding officer trying to get him to do what you want him to do. He's incredibly insubordinate, or as one of Kirby Smith's staff officers put it in a letter to his mother, he's simply a very bad man. So, whatever we might think about the Trans-Mississippi, if we look at what the quality of men who were sent to command, it's clear that Jeff Davis and Abraham Lincoln didn't think much of the Trans-Mississippi. And just to put the tin hat on it, there were the people who turned down command in the West, the Trans-Mississippi. Davis's first choice was Harry Heath. Harry Heath at that point was notorious only for putting buckets over the door at West Point. He was the resident joker. And this is before his famous portrayal in Gettysburg as one of the bright sparks in the Army of Northern Virginia. The only useful purpose I think the Trans-Mississippi might have served is the second guy who was offered command who turned it down was Braxton Bragg. Just imagine if he'd accepted command and somebody vaguely competent who could cooperate was given command in the West. But it was not to be. And so, the Trans-Mississippi remained isolated, distant, of very little use in terms of manpower, supply, a drain, frankly. And really, what on earth are we doing here other than having a wonderful opportunity to go to the bar afterwards?
Thank you for that, Ryan. Just to say, this is Ryan's first conference and his maiden speech to the society, and that was really brilliant. Which frankly, I expected nothing more, having some experience of your knowledge of the Civil War. But obviously, I'm going to try and tell you that you're wrong.
I expect nothing less.
So I want to go back to my first conference, which was 2011. And Charles was, I don't know if Charles had his icebreaker before then, but I remember Charles had an icebreaker that year. And it was another debate. I can't remember who was actually talking. But the theme of the war was war in 1861 inevitable? It was the sesquicentennial. Inevitable is a big word. The war was inevitable because it happened. If you want to say anything else, then it's a what if, and I don't like what ifs because you can make up whatever you like. So the real question that Charles was asking, as far as I'm concerned, is why did the war happen? And the answer to that is very simple. It happened because of the Trans-Mississippi. Now, the what-ifers in that debate were coming up with things like, well, slavery might have died out of its own accord, or there'd been political compromises before, so there could have been political compromises again. Well, let's start looking at where those compromises are. What's the big one? It's 1820. It's the Missouri Compromise. It's in the Trans-Mississippi. And then we get another one in 1850, which we heard about in March from Kevin Wade. We don't talk about it as a compromise, but the accession of California into the Union is a compromise. You've got a free state coming in below that compromise line that was established in 1820. And in return, you get the Fugitive Slave Act, which is one of the most divisive pieces of legislation, surely, in history. And it escalates that problem about slavery. Then, having allowed or got a free state south of the Missouri Compromise line, the southern faction wants a slave state north of the Compromise line, when the Kansas-Nebraska come in 1856. Now, in parallel with all that, we get the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott is a Missouri slave. And the whole case is about whether Scott stays a slave or becomes free by going into a free territory. So, the issue in the war is not the existence or protection of slavery in the South, it's the extension of slavery into the Trans-Mississippi. Or, for those it's the extension of the Southern socio-economic culture, which is based upon forced labour and theories of racial supremacy, for which slavery is merely the top of the pyramid. Now, 1820 and 1850 are not war. But with the greatest respect to Scott, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and all those thousands of black Americans who struggled to end slavery by their own efforts, war comes about because white people are prepared to kill white people over the issue. And where does that happen first? Well, if you go to Kansas, you'll be told that the war didn't start in Charleston Harbor, but the first battle was in a little obscure place called Blackjack on the Santa Fe Trail in 2nd of June 1856, where John Brown and his boys take on a pro-slavery gang under a man called Henry Pate. Now, Blackjack is actually a bloodless battle, but this comes immediately after the Pottawatomie massacre of 5 people by John Brown. By 1859, over 50 people had died in Kansas. Now, this may not be a war between the states, but it illustrates a state of mind which makes the war possible. And it's in the Trans-Mississippi. So, the war doesn't flow from east to west, it flows from west to east. So, let's look at the war. Well, I'm not going to deny that all of the big battles, all of the big battalions are fighting over in the east. Of course they are. But is size actually important? By that token, the only battles in the Second World War that matter are the ones on the Eastern Front in Russia. And that includes everything that happens after D-Day in Western Europe, because Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin, they are still much bigger than anything that we ever fought. Now, if I stood up here and told you to dismiss Tobruk, Alamein, Salerno, Cassino as mere sideshows, would anyone seriously accept that statement? I don't think so. In 1893, something called the Civil War Site Advisory Commission produced a report on battles and battlefields with a view to establishing priority over preservation sites. And it classified about 1,000 actions. And it classified them as A, B, C and D, with A being the most important. Now, A is defined as, and I quote, a general engagement involving field armies in which a commander achieved a vital strategic objective. Such a result may include an indisputable victory on the field or be limited to the success or termination of a campaign offensive. Most importantly, decisive battles had a direct, observable impact on the direction, duration, conduct or outcome of the war. Now, it won't surprise you to know that 13 of those 40 battles were in Virginia. 7 are in Tennessee. What might surprise you is that 5 are in the Trans-Mississippi. We're going to be covering 4 of them this weekend. We would have been covering 5, but unfortunately Ian Mitchell can't be here, and he's doing his ones in July on a Zoom presentation. Let's just talk through the war, and Ryan talked about the Anaconda Plan and all of that sort of thing. In 1861, after Bull Run, it's not the Trans-Mississippi which is a sideshow. It's this phony war that's going on in Virginia. Missouri, along with Kentucky, is actually the focus of the war. Lincoln is very famous for saying, I want God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. But he must have Missouri as well. Missouri is split. It's got a star on both flags. And I'm actually thinking of copywriting that as a book title, which is really good, isn't it? I'm not going to engage in what-ifs about what's going to happen if Missouri goes out for the Confederacy. But what I will say is that a war in which the St. Louis Arsenal or the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi are in Confederate hands is going to be different. Ryan mentioned Nathaniel Lyons. The first general to be killed is in the Trans-Mississippi. What effect he would have had on the war, I'm not going to argue, but it's significant. Pea Ridge in March 1862 is fought by 26,000 men. Now, that's not an order of magnitude less than the 36,000 people who are actually engaged at Bull Run, or the 40,000 people who are engaged at Fort Donelson, which we all accept are important battles. So Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge are important battles in the context of the time. Now, I would agree with Ryan that from Shiloh onwards, you get these mega battles happening out east. And for the next 18 months or so, the conventional war in the Trans-Mississippi does fade into significance in some respect. But I still don't accept that it totally means that it's irrelevant, because we talked about, Ryan touched on the Mississippi campaign. Again, I'm not going to indulge in what ifs, but the Mississippi campaign is going to be different if it's not for the impact of the Trans-Mississippi. Van Dorn, not the greatest general by anybody's stretch of the imagination, but Van Dorn's operations against Grant's supply line are critical in 1862 in holding up his campaign against Vicksburg. The impact of the CSS Arkansas. Yes, okay, they're using up railroads. They think it's a better strategic use of resources. But again, the impact of the Arkansas on the operations of Farragut's fleet, it doesn't stop the success of the armies in the Mississippi, but it has an impact. The success of that campaign ultimately depends upon Trans-Mississippi operations. Now, I've lost my piece of paper. I just wanted to break here for a message from our sponsor, because I've mentioned the Arkansas. So I'm very pleased to say that we are being sponsored today by Arkansas Tourism. And there are some brochures at the back. Unfortunately, there isn't actually a great deal about the Civil War in here, but it's a lovely state to visit, and I do recommend it to everybody. So please take your brochure from the back. So, moving on to 1864. Mississippi moves in Union hands. This is isolated, absolutely meaningless, isn't it? Well, okay, in beginning of 1864, the Union plans its operations for that year. And Shreveport is one of the 4 top objectives, after Richmond, Atlanta and Mobile. And I'm sure Jeff's going to cover exactly why on Sunday, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. What's interesting is, Ryan was talking about nobody wanting to go to the Trans-Mississippi. Sherman actually put himself forward to lead that campaign. Sherman is, of course, formerly a professor in the Louisiana Military Academy, so he's got local knowledge. But he doesn't see it as a sideshow. He sees it as a chance to make a success, make a name for himself. 1864 Price's campaign. It's an interesting one. A few years back, Frank O'Reilly, was 2014, Frank O'Reilly talked about Cedar Creek. And he talked about Cedar Creek as being a really influential battle because of its potential impact on the presidential election. Again, Carl's going to talk about Price's invasion. I don't want to say too much, but the point is that Price's invasion is driven by the same motives. It's very easy for us to look back in hindsight and say it failed, it wasn't going to do anything. But when commanders are making a decision, they're not making the decision in hindsight. They are making the decision based upon what they think they might be able to do. And in the context of the time, this is not a sideshow. It is something which could not be ignored. It had the potential to disrupt the election. Ryan spent a long time saying that commanders in the Trans-Mississippi were inferior, and I'm not going to go into individuals. There are crap individuals everywhere in the Civil War, and there were some good commanders in the Civil War. Commanders in lesser theatres, to my mind, always have a big problem. Because if they make a mistake, it demonstrates that they're unfit for high command. If they win, well, they weren't up against the top 9 guys, were they? So, that doesn't count. Carl and I were talking earlier this afternoon. A classic example for me is Mark Clark in World War II. How good is Mark Clark? We don't know. It's very, very difficult to judge him. It's very easy to criticise him, but it's very difficult to judge him. How would we judge Wellington if he'd never fought Waterloo? He fought in an isolated theatre. He never fought any top French generals prior to 1815. Rich is going to disagree with me. And conversely, generals in these isolated theatres have different problems to people who are fighting major campaigns. They're strapped for resources. They're struggling with logistics. Absolutely. Does that make them bad commanders? General Slim fought in a forgotten theatre against nobody of any consequence, but a poll a few years back rated him as Britain's top general ever. I'm not saying I would agree with that either, but we have to judge these people not on what they might have achieved, but on what they actually did achieve. Samuel Curtis is the victor in 2 of those Class A battles. The only people who won more Class A battles are Lee and Grant. That has to say something, surely? Richard Taylor doesn't get on with his subordinates. Well, nor did Nathan Bedford Forrest, nor did lots of commanders, quite frankly. He fights a masterly campaign in 1864. As does Joseph Shelby, who some people regard as one of the best cavalry commanders of the war. So there are good commanders west of the Mississippi. Some of these men don't get high command because they don't want it. But bear in mind that Robert E. Lee chose to fight in Virginia. He didn't want to go anywhere else. They stayed to defend their home states. That doesn't necessarily make them poor or irrelevant. But I want to talk now about the things that Ryan didn't talk about, because it's not the conventional war that actually makes Trans-Mississippi important. It's the nature of the war. This is not a war between states. This is a war within states. Any civil war pits neighbour against neighbour, friend against friend, even brother against brother. In the Trans-Mississippi, that all happens faster and much, much more deeper than anywhere else. We all know that Missouri splits, but what about Arkansas? Arkansas provides more white troops to the Union than any other Confederate state. and it's the fourth least populous. And it isn't just the states, and it isn't just white people. Talked about the Indians. The Trans-Mississippi encompasses all those Indian territories. Several Indian nations are drawn into this conflict. The Cherokees, slaveholding, are split between a pro-Confederate and a pro-Union faction. And then there's the black Americans. Forget Fort Wagner, forget the South Carolina coast. The first engagement of black troops in combat is on October the 29th, 1862 at Isle of Man, Missouri. There's a very good article by Terry on the internet about it. First Kansas Colored Volunteers. They're mustered into federal service the following January. Again, the first black troops in federal service. In 1863, Honey Springs, again, Terry's going to talk about this later in the weekend. White, black and Indian troops on the same battlefield, the white troops are in a minority. This is a much more complex war than we see out east. And it's more brutal. This is the frontier. Violence is part of life. It's part of the culture. Victory goes to the strong, it doesn't go to the righteous. And because of Kansas, there's a model for these paramilitary organizations. In the East, it takes time for that violence to escalate, and most of those partisan groups are Confederates. In the Trans-Mississippi, it begins almost immediately. People like Quantrill are forming their guerrilla gangs in the first year of the war. And it's not just the Confederates. The Unionists form these gangs as well. The Missouri town of Osceola had 2,500 inhabitants in 1861. In September, it was sacked by a Unionist force under Jim Lane. 9 men were killed, and virtually every single building was burned. Osceola has never recovered. Its population today is less than 1,000 people. That's the context in which you have to put the activities of men like Quantrill and Bill Anderson. And that paramilitary violence is countered by government violence. General Order Number 11, 25th of August, 1863, issued by Thomas Ewing, related to Sherman, also, I might add, related very distantly by marriage to Gillian, so he keeps quiet about it mostly. It creates what's called the Burnt District. Now, in 2016, Gillian and I went to Belarus, totally impossible to go to nowadays, I think. And you see memorials to the destruction of villages by the Nazis. And what these memorials are is a house, and all you have left of the house is a chimney. And that's what the Burnt District looks like. And in fact, there is a Burnt District memorial in Cass County, which consists of one of those reconstructed chimneys. Order 11 is not only the forerunner for Sheridan in the Valley and Sherman in Georgia, it's the prototype for British concentration camps in South Africa, for Nazi suppression of partisans in Eastern Europe, and even new villages in Malaya. It's a counter-terrorist tactic which perpetuates after the Civil War. It's the brutal and unorganised execution of war, not against armies, but against the populations that support those armies. And in 1863, it is unprecedented. Now, I've started to sort of talk about the legacy of the war in the Trans-Mississippi with those observations. Now, clearly, if the region is the cause of the war, which I believe it is, it's important to review the consequences. Kevin Waite's going to talk about some of this tomorrow, but let's just start with Reconstruction. Louisiana is the first state to have a Reconstruction government from 1862, because that's the first state that actually has its capital occupied. Now that doesn't unfortunately mean that Reconstruction is any more successful than anyone else. In 1866, there were 2,000 people killed during the Louisiana elections. Somewhere between 38 and 200 are killed in the New Orleans riot in July. The vagaries about the numbers is quite significant in its own right, I think. Organisations like the Klan are just as active in the Trans-Mississippi as anywhere else. there's a really good programme which, if you get a chance to catch it, Deb Goodrich, who talked to us last month, it's a programme called Aftershock, and a lot of that programme talks about the Trans-Mississippi Plan and the Trans-Mississippi Reconstruction. And it's really interesting, lots of stuff that you'll see in there that you won't have seen anywhere else. In 1868, a Republican congressman in Arkansas is murdered by the Klan. So this experience is perhaps no different from anywhere else in the South. But I think there are some other things going on in the Trans-Mississippi as well. And they again rise out of the fact that this is a frontier. Homestead Act, 1862. Now, going back to this being a war over the expansion of slavery, the Homestead Act is just as much an act of war as the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a northern model of settlement, which with a northern victory is then imposed upon the western expansion of the United States. It's a clear defeat for Southern war aims, and it's a clear victory for the North. Then there's the matter of Indian relations. It's not quite as straightforward as Ryan would say it, would put it, I say. The United States actually fights two wars during this period. It fights the Civil War, and it fights a war against the Sioux Nation in Minnesota. And I do mean Minnesota because that's where most of the Sioux are based at that time. It's almost completely forgotten, apart from an appalling film called The Great Sioux Uprising, which I suspect that even Roger is not going to bless with a mention. The Great Sioux Uprising.
Funnily enough.
You're going to mention it, Roger. It's totally unhistoric. It's awful. Anyway. This thing is significant. The motive for the uprising is that the government defaults on its annuity payments. That's directly as a result of the financial constraints of the Civil War. You've got weakened federal government, so that gives the Sioux the opportunity to do this. This is the initial uprising and the attacks on civilians around the New Ulm area. That is the biggest civilian loss of life in a single day in the United States prior to 9/11. And it's almost completely forgotten. Also almost completely forgotten is the fact that 38 Sioux were executed as a result of this uprising. That is the largest single mass execution in the United States to this day. The subsequent campaign lasts about a year. You can go and drive it. You either need a very good sat-nav or a very good navigator. But more importantly, of course, this is a war which is going to continue in effect for another 13, at least, maybe 30 years, if you want to take it all the way to Wounded Knee. Now, having mentioned the movies, I don't want to steal too much of your thunder here. But the popular culture goes back to this idea that yes, the Civil War happens, and then we go off and fight the Red Man. There is a film, I think it's She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and the final scene is John Wayne, who is clearly a former Confederate, and his officer, who is clearly a former Unionist. And John Wayne gets his promotion, probably to sergeant, I think. And the officer hands him the papers and says, look, they've been signed by Sheridan, Sherman, and Grant. How about that? And John Wayne says, yeah, but wouldn't it have been great if they could have been signed by Robert E. Lee? And they agree, and they laugh about it, and they ride off into the sunset, and everybody's happy, and the Union is restored. But of course that's not what really happens. There's a whole load of unreconciled Confederates in the Trans-Mississippi. There's Richard Taylor, who goes off to Mexico and founds colonies, and there are others as well. And there's people like the James and the Younger brothers who learn their trade in the Civil War. And they become inured to violence as a result of the war. Bleeding Canvas merges into the Civil War, merges into the Wild West. It is a continuum of violence. I mentioned Osceola. In the town there is an unashamedly Confederate memorial. It's actually a very nice memorial, frankly. Very nicely designed. It's got little bricks which have the names of the fallen. Now, in itself, that's I don't have a problem with that. And then you look at some of the names and you get Jesse James and Quantrill. And then that's a little bit darker. Osceola has not forgotten the war. In 2011, it petitioned to have the Kansas University football team drop the Jayhawk mascot and name. This is still an open wound in some areas in the Trans-Mississippi. And if you look at the race disturbances of this century, actually a lot of them aren't in the Deep South. A lot of them are in this area here. The war is still an open wound. In fact, if you go to the John Brown Memorial Park in Osawatomie, you will see Confederate flags flying outside the gates. I suspect that John Brown's body isn't mouldering in its grave, it's turning in it. So, that's why I think the Trans-Mississippi is important and we're having this conference. It's the cause of the war. It features important battles, but more importantly, it drives the nature of the war to its extremes. And the legacy of the war persists here perhaps longer than anywhere else in the United States. The political focus of the war may be on the Eastern Seaboard up in Washington and Richmond. The military decision of the war may be down here in the South in Georgia. But the emotional heart of the war is here in the Trans-Mississippi.